Political interference and erosion of trust. The back and forth over the SNC-Lavalin controversy crested today, with the Prime Minister adding his perspective to that of all the other players who've made their views known over the past few weeks. It's all offered Canadians a fascinating and possibly unprecedented look behind the curtain of the Prime Minister's office. But what's it doing to Justin Trudeau's brand, the opposition's standing, and how people will vote in the October federal election? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Jeffrey Simpson, the former national affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail, now a fellow at the University of Ottawa. And Ginny Roth, Ontario PC Party strategist and a senior consultant at Crestview Strategy. And here in our studio, Shachi Kurl, executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, and John Duffy, Liberal Party strategist and founder at principal at Strategy Corp. And we're delighted to welcome everybody back to our program. And I want to start with our good friend in Ottawa, Mr. Simpson, who hasn't been here in way too long, so we're going to put him to work right away. The Prime Minister was at work pretty early this morning, Jeffrey. 8 o'clock news conference this morning. How well do you think he did resetting the narrative and potentially turning around the fortunes of his government?
I don't think you turn the fortunes around with one press conference. So he made the best defense he could. Obviously, his critics won't be convinced. I have no idea what the effect of that press conference will be on the next election. I have no idea what the current affair in Ottawa will have on the next election. Maybe it's just my age, but I saw a lot of these sorts of things over the decades of my career. And at the end of the day, in an election campaign, very seldom did they have a determinate effect. You know the old Harold Wilson line, it's now a cliche. A week is a long time in politics. 8 months before the last Canadian election, the NDP were measuring the drapes in the Prime Minister's office, as I recall. 6 or 8 months before the last American election, Hillary Clinton was picking her cabinet. And 6 or 8 months before the last French election, very few people knew who Emmanuel Macron was. So I read people making confident predictions about how this issue will frame the next election, how Mr. Trudeau has no chance to win, et cetera, and I just retreat to the Harold Wilson line. The week is a long time in politics.
Ginny, that seems like very good advice from a guy who's been around the block a few times. Do you want to add to your view on how Justin Trudeau did this morning?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I'll quarrel with any of that. The election is also 8 months away, so that's a lot of weeks. But look, I do think that there's one thing that we know, which is we have only known one kind of Justin Trudeau. We've known the sunny ways, doing politics differently, different kind of Liberal Party led by Justin Trudeau. He's been very, very successful owning and leading with that brand. I think that brand has suffered a fatal blow. That doesn't mean Justin Trudeau has suffered a fatal blow or that the Liberal Party can't come back and win another majority government. Of course they can. But he won't be able to run the election as a doing politics differently, different kind of Liberal anymore. I think that's shot. So the big open question is what does his brand look like going forward? How does that narrative interplay with an Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh narrative going forward? And what I do know is that he's going to have to confront some of the sort of stink that comes from this scandal. And while it may not, be the only thing that defines the election in the fall, it will permeate. It'll stick, and it'll be something he has to answer for and redefine his ballot question.
Which leads me to John Duffy. You just heard what Ginny had to say about that. The woman sitting beside you the other day said Justin Trudeau's brand, the shine is not dented or scratched, it's been completely scuffed. Okay, to which you say what in response to all of that?
Well, I think Ginny's identified and you're identifying the place where all of this in Ottawa will or will not have an impact in voting behavior. And by the way, I'm inclined to agree with Jeff and his sage wisdom about the passage of time in all of this. We're a long way out from the election. I think the Conservatives are going to attempt to equate any scuff on the shine of doing politics differently with being the same old kind of Liberal. I don't think that's sticking. They're two very different propositions. It's one thing not to be the amazing, adventitious Justin Trudeau of 2015.
You're going to have to define that word for some of us.
Of or pertaining to an advent, an arrival, an impending arrival, okay?
Leave it to John Duffy to pull a $35 word out of his back pocket, but anyway.
It's one thing to have that incredible sensation of newness, and Obama had that in 2008.
Yeah. But you get that once, right?
You get that once. Yeah. Someone, for it to be a real problem, has to contest it and take it away from you. I don't see Andrew Scheer offering that. I don't see Jagmeet Singh offering that. Elizabeth may offer that. We'll see. But the other question is, does that mean the Liberal Party and the Trudeau version of the Liberal Party has been debranded to where it's just a bunch of those Liberals who you know and love from horrible episodes like the Hamilton Harbour scandal, or
you're going way
the
back
Judges
now.
Affair,
Yeah.
or sponsorship more recently, or Beauharnois if you're really into ancient history from almost 100 years ago. That version of the Liberal Party is deeply obnoxious to voters, and we're nowhere near that. No one has even alleged that we are anywhere near that. There are no allegations that even look like that. So that's the kind of debranding that gets you into serious political trouble. We're not talking about anything like that. And the key point is that what Trudeau was doing this morning was reasserting, wait, I'm the only guy who's still got even a claim to make about doing politics in a different way. And he actually went out of his way in his remarks to say, I still believe in trying to do that differently.
Shachi, it's clearly too early to have any reliable polling data which would suggest here's what Canadians think about what the Prime Minister attempted to do this morning. But maybe you can tell us whether you know whether people in this country think this is a big deal or not.
Well, 2 weeks ago, they thought it was a big deal. The issue, a week ago, 4 days ago, they thought it was a big deal. What we've seen in the last 2 days between the testimony of Gerald Butts, the second round of testimony of Michael Wernick, and then the statements from the Prime Minister this morning have done nothing to make that a smaller deal. So what we are dealing with from a public assessment of the extent to which people are engaged on this issue and whether they're truly ticked off about this issue or sort of eyeballing it and going, nah, you know, we don't care, let's move on. And by the way, I do think they care. We are looking at a skier who's taken a mogul very badly and is now careening down a hill. They're
This is
hitting
the PM you're talking about?
well, and the Liberal government. They're sliding, they're bumping, they're shifting, and it's like watching, you know, Super G on television. You go, that has to hurt. But we don't know if this is spinal fracture or rib fracture or miraculously they're going to get up and walk away.
Well, or is the skier still upright?
Not at the moment, but it doesn't mean they can't get back upright. And what I mean by that is not that, you know, again, reiterating Jeffrey's point, reiterating the fullness of time. We also have to see the Prime Minister find a way to turn the page on this. And this morning did not really do that. He is not going to be the last to speak on this matter. It's quite likely there will be more testimony before the Justice Committee. And if there isn't, this government then stands accused of not being transparent, which is, you know, the last pieces of that brand will then be gone.
Let me get Jeffrey Simpson to react to I'm thinking of Sid Caesar right now with your show of shows. Here are your poll of polls. The CBC tends to take an aggregate of all of the polls that are out there, and what they have determined is that the Conservatives are nudging up around 37%, the Liberals just a titch over 33%, the NDP south of 16%. You know, the polls would have said something very different 6 months ago, Jeffrey. This is where they tend to be right now.
They did say something.
How worried should the Liberals be about where they are in the public opinion surveys now?
Well, I think they should be concerned because you don't want to be behind, right? This particular affair in Ottawa doesn't help for a couple of reasons. One is that resignation of two ministers is a serious business, and these were two high-profile ministers. Secondly, it is impossible for a government, any government, when they're involved in an affair like this, to get their message on other issues out. Over the last couple of weeks, the Prime Minister was in Vancouver talking about assisted housing. He was in Montreal talking about the space program. He's been talking about public transit and infrastructure. And now he's going up to the far north to talk yet another apology to another group. The media gives him one sentence, and then they turn to this. So it's very hard to get your agenda, whatever it is, out to the public when the media is hyperventilating over the sniff of scandal, which I've seen many times in my career. And I mean hyperventilate. By the way, there's a very sharp difference between the coverage, both on television and in the written press in the province of Quebec about this. They're much calmer about it and much more balanced than the hyperventilation we're seeing in English-speaking Canadian press.
To what do you attribute the hyperventilation?
Sniff of scandal always drives the media to like dogs, you know, when they're hungry. It's phenomenal. And I think that's happening here. I mean, I'm not going to point any fingers at anybody, but when you see civil war, or you see people saying that Justin Trudeau's worse than Donald Trump. When you see, the clock is ticking, Mr. Trudeau, you see people pronouncing with tremendous confidence that the next election is going to be framed by this issue. That's what I mean by hyperventilating. It makes good copy, I guess.
Shachi.
Well, I think, to Jeffrey's point, the next election may or may not be framed by that issue, and it has a lot to do with what Andrew Scheer does next. So this is the person who actually has some say in how this all goes, and it's really going to be his moment to take advantage of, or to lose the opportunity on. So today we started to see Justin Trudeau try to pivot and try this new message around, and we've heard it in the last 2 days: jobs, jobs, jobs. Did we mention 9,000 jobs? So many jobs. And also there are job losses, or the threat of job losses back west, dealing with the oil and gas industry, dealing with agriculture. And so as we start to see the economy slowing and some concerning points on that front, I think the Liberals have figured out that they find the bread versus integrity equation is going to be more resonant on the bread side. For Andrew Scheer, though, he gets to come out and be like, hey, bread and integrity. We won't be those Liberals.
Well, let me put that to Ginny, because 1 in 4 Canadians, according to our friend Nick Nanos, who's done the research on this, say that this affair, this SNC-Lavalin situation, will affect their vote in 8 months' time. Now, that's what they're saying today. Obviously, the election being in October, we don't know today whether that will have the impact in October that people today say it will. Do you see Andrew Scheer's job, Ginny, as essentially just keeping this fire as red hot as possible for as long as possible?
I do, and it's not because I think that when people vote in the fall, they're going to look at their ballot and think, what were the details of that question of prosecutorial interference? They're not, but they're going to think, what do I think of the three leaders as compared to each other, and who do I want to be prime minister? And the reason that Andrew Scheer's prosecutorial approach, his approach of keeping this in the news, asking the tough questions, continuing to raise red flags, is because he's seeing the damage it's doing to the Trudeau brand. And the reason I think that the Trudeau brand matters is not so much on scandal and integrity. That's important, certainly. But I think, frankly, with the Liberals, there's a bit of historical scandal baked in. And in the past, people have plugged their nose and voted Liberal, regardless of a history of scandal. So I don't think that will be the deciding factor. But I do think people are going to look and say, on the big questions that impact my life, the economy, jobs, et cetera, who do I trust more? And so much of what Justin Trudeau's offering says is, trust me for long-term solutions. Trust me for big, sweeping programs, national programs that are going to take a while to roll out. Trust me. And in the last election, people really did. They put a lot of trust in him. And if the trust factor erodes, then his entire ballot question becomes a big problem. Whereas Andrew Scheer, I think, is saying, you might not know me all that well, but you're going to grow to like me because I'm a likable guy. And a lot of my solutions are going to be shorter term. I'm going to take the GSTF, your home heating, basic things that people can understand. And so the leap, I think, is much less significant. And that's where I think Scheer's doing really good work now to erode that trust so that he can step in with an offering that people can say, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Equal time for John Duffy.
Well, Trudeau has two pretty big cards that he can put down in that game. And they're not long-term deliverables. Although I don't disagree, Ginny. I mean, some of the things some of the major program initiatives feel somewhat distant, much though they're popular. The two cards that he can put down are continued strong economic performance, and that's in the hands of the fates. But he can also point to the achievement of renegotiating NAFTA. And from that comes dealing with one of the issues that has made Canadians most anxious, which has been, how do you handle the administration in Washington? There is no question that they have posted a success in dealing with an incredibly challenging situation. It is seen as a success. Mr. Trudeau owns that success and it has a good point to make in a leader's debate to say, I did that. Are you sure that there's someone else who can do something like that on this stage? That's a pretty powerful claim to credibility. And I think it tends to get forgotten when we think of what could happen in all of this. And some people are starting to say, oh, the boy king is not a good ruler. You get some of that in the pages of the print media in particular. He's got some pretty powerful cards to push back against that suit.
Let's just talk for a moment here about how popular or not the three major party leaders are in the nation's capital right now. And to that end, we're going to bring up this graphic here. This is all data from the Abacus organization. Here's approval and disapproval numbers for Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister. Approving 33%, disapproving 46%. He's 13 points underwater, as they say right now. Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader of the opposition, approval 30, disapproval 26, so he's above ground by 4 points. And Jagmeet Singh, who of course only been in Parliament for a very short time, approval 21%, disapproval 28%, so he's 7 points underwater. You know, John, take a look at these numbers. I mean, this is certainly not where Trudeau was 6 months ago. How baked in do you think this stuff is right now?
It's not great. Is it baked in? It's only been a month of unrelieved negative coverage at a saturation level. I don't think, look, I'm not a media critic and I'm not a media executive. I can tell you it is difficult to sustain this level of attention on an issue, this technical level of detail for 8 months. Extremely difficult no matter how hard you try. In addition, parties being swept into office on scandals, pretty rare occasion, pretty rare occurrence in Canadian history, although it can happen. And I think there's this all-important point of connecting the dots. Ginny has now come back to a couple of times because this is really important. If the Conservatives can relate this behavior of Trudeau's and this issue of what's happened lately to some sort of muscle memory in the electorate that Liberals, you can't trust them because they got ethics problems, it kind of baked into their DNA, then we got something here that could really move a lot of votes. I don't believe that that is true in substance, and I think it's a very difficult stretch for the Conservatives to pull that. They might put an ad or two in that direction, but I don't think it'll really land home the way that it did, for example, when they said, you know what, the Martin government is just another Liberal government because look at like sponsorship and now this Mountie thing, oh God, they're all the same. I don't think that's going to happen this time.
Shachi.
So a couple of things. I think that the drip, drip, drip over time will be hard to escape for the Liberals. Now, to what extent does that become the issue that people vote about in the ballot box? To Ginny's point, to John's point, let's see. However, there's other things I'm watching. So yes, this is playing differently in Quebec, as Jeffrey's pointed out, but there are also key bases that the Liberals really relied on in 2015 that put them over the top, and I want to see what happens with them. First of all, the party, on the back of Justin Trudeau's clean and shiny and virtuous brand, managed to grow the base. They grew the base with minority groups, with First Nations, and particularly with young people who don't show up to vote that often.
Except when you legalize their pot.
Well, so what's the next lever they pull? If the next lever they pull was supposed to be, we still do politics differently, that's gone. So what is the play to young people, and how do they get young people interested, or do they stay home? Also, do women stay home? It's not necessarily about the migration of the vote to another party. It's also about people who either park themselves in the undecided or the will not vote folder and don't show up.
I'm interested in Jeffrey Simpson's take on the fact that two of the leaders I just mentioned are rookies. They have never contested a general election. The Prime Minister himself has only fought one general election. So we have, relatively speaking, a relatively new cast of characters here. Do you think that says anything about the state of our political culture, Jeffrey?
Yes, it does, in the sense that, and this is a subject for a much longer conversation, but it's difficult to win party leaderships, apparently, after you've been in public life for a long period of time. It's almost held against you that you have a lot of experience. Now, the exception to that would be, of course, Mr. Chrétien. But remember, Mr. Mulroney hadn't been around very long when he came in. Mr. Trudeau Sr. hadn't been around very long before he became Prime Minister. So I think it's very hard to get people of real quality into public life and keep them in public life. That's a whole other conversation. The other two leaders have the advantage of being unknowns. And so the devil you know often looks worse than the devils you don't. I will say about those numbers, I mean, a poll does not a summer make. Those are not good numbers for the Prime Minister, because the undecided voters in an election campaign and the ones who are unaffiliated usually vote on the basis of which leader they can trust. And so if you've got those kind of numbers, that isn't very good. The last thing I'll say, and this is a bit, it's confusing to me. It's been confusing from the beginning. A reference was made a minute ago to the jobs, jobs, jobs argument and the juxtaposition of that versus the law. First of all, the Attorney General is not supposed to consider the impact on the economy in making a decision whether to prosecute or not. You may say the law is an ass, it shouldn't be that way, but that is the law. So I think you had to come at this both in your private conversations inside the government and with the public saying this, look, there are two perfectly legal ways of dealing with this issue. One is prosecution, the other is negotiation. Both involve punishments of a company that has done wrong. Prosecution is morally wonderful. It certainly, if you're successful, sends a powerful signal of disapproval, not just to the company, but to other companies about whom there might be questions. And there'll be a rallying by the public that you nailed those bastards. The problem with that is, as anybody who's aware of our court system knows, it moves at the fastest at a glacial pace. So you can bet that a criminal prosecution of a company will take years and might be appealed, and lawyers will get very rich, and the outcome is uncertain. The prosecutors may think going into a case, we've got a slam dunk case, it's iron cast. Well, how many prosecutions have fallen apart in the light of a trial or an appeal? The negotiated settlement, doesn't bring you the moral satisfaction of a prosecution, but it brings you finality. It's shorter and it's less expensive. And I thought the government should have, right from the beginning, said, these are both legal avenues. And on balance, we favored this one over the prosecution, but it is up to the Attorney General to decide. So when I talked to her, Jerry Butts or Mr. Trudeau or Bill Morneau, we said, look, Minister, this other route is cheaper, it's more effective, and it produces finality. And she could have said, I'm sorry, I'm an experienced prosecutor in British Columbia, I don't agree. That would have allowed you to stand on the same kind of ground rather than dealing with the grubby issues of Quebec politics and its fortunes for the Liberals or jobs, jobs, jobs.
I got to put that to John Duffy, because that sounds like an eminently reasonable and strategically very smart approach that should have been taken and clearly wasn't taken. Do you know why it wasn't taken?
It leaves, it's eminently sensible and well argued. I think it doesn't cover some other aspects of this.
For example?
Well, I think the biggest one is a lot of the puzzling communications strategies about this can be explained by paying attention to the internal dynamics of the Liberal caucus and cabinet. And that's really what opened up when Minister Philpott resigned. There's a lot of journalists who've written about this. Don Linehan actually was the first one, I think, to write about it. It's a pretty smart point in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald. And he said, look, there's a lot of people in the Trudeau government who are new to politics. There's a lot of people in the Trudeau government who came in because they believed passionately about doing things differently. That had a kind of hard encounter with a classic tough political situation. And I think there was a lack of emotional preparation for this kind of tough political situation sort of hitting the boat. And a lot of people were obviously in an awkward position suddenly about what they thought their life was going to be like in politics. And I don't say that in a way that denigrates at all. I think a lot of what the Prime Minister spent the past week doing has been dealing with people one by one and saying, and so is his team, where they're welcome, and saying, we're still in this for the right reasons. We're still trying to do this differently. We understand that this should have been better handled. But you can't have just come out in that calm way in describing it and suddenly had the whole caucus going, oh, we're going to do this? This landed as a complete surprise to everybody in the system. I can tell you, I mean, there was maybe a handful of people who saw there could be a collision here at some point. So I think I will chalk up Jeff's very wise point to being yet another good communication strategy that could have been tried in a long litany of ones that weren't tried, and that's going to be part of the history of this when it's all written.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, I think the histories that will be written will be largely technical, and they won't be ones about the fall of a government. This isn't the pipeline debate. It's not Bourgeois. It's not sponsorship.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock here because we've talked about the PM, we've talked about the opposition leader. We have to talk about the newest leader in the Parliament of Canada, Jagmeet Singh, your fellow British Columbian, if I can put it that way.
As far as I know, he's from Brampton. But
He is from Brampton, but of course he represents.
No one's from BC. Everybody who comes
I'm
there.
from BC.
You were born there.
I was
Oh,
born and raised there.
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
found her, folks.
He was neither born nor raised there, but he represents a Burnaby riding right now. What's job one for him right now?
Be noticed in this conversation. So when we talk about whether it is hyperventilative coverage or whether it is reasoned and defensible coverage of this scandal, it has largely focused obviously on the main players, Ms. Wilson-Raybould, Mr. Butts, Ms. Philpott, and obviously the Prime Minister, and it has focused on Andrew Scheer. And I think
and
in
Lisa
part,
Raitt, I think, can claim some
for sure.
ice time on
and
this as
I think
well.
in part the conservative attention on this has reflected the fact that it is at this point a conservative lead we're seeing over several polls, and if there is, I think, an assumed, again, 7 months being a long time in politics, but if there is an assumed face-off at the ballot box this fall, it seems to be one that is shaping up between the Conservatives and the Liberals. Of course, you can't count anyone out, but for the NDP to get back into this, Mr. Singh needs to find a way to be relevant in this, and I don't know that his voice is necessarily being heard. Indeed, it's being drowned out by Elizabeth Mays at the moment.
How worried? Sorry, Jeffrey, go ahead. I think I heard you coming in there.
Well, I was going to ask, why are so many New Democrat MPs leaving?
Yeah, because there's been no traction to this point. But look, there's a lot of room for Jagmeet Singh here. I mean, to John's point, Trudeau and his team went out there and recruited traditionally candidates who would be viewed as very progressive, who may have traditionally run for the NDP. Jody Wilson-Raybould, I think, is a really good example of that. And they were really effective in recruiting them to run for the Liberals. And part of it was the sales job of Justin Trudeau is a different kind of leader. We're going to do politics differently. We're going to be a really progressive, feminist, Liberal government that's going to attract young people. And it did. It attracted young voters. There's huge room, I think, now for Jagmeet Singh to say, all that space that you ate up in the sort of center left and left of center is now ours for the taking. Because Liberals, you've let people down on climate change, you've let people down on electoral reform, and now you've let people down on ethics too. And you've left down these people that you recruited into your party. Now, it's still early days. He hasn't been all that effective. And partially it's because as the leader of the third party, that's tougher. But as the cameras turn to him and we get into an election period, there's a big question of whether he'll be able to make hay of that. And I think he will. He was at Queen's Park in Ontario politics when I was there, and he was very impactful. There's a reason why he won the leadership. He can be strong, and a lot can change. I mean, to our earlier points about how much can change in the 8 or 9 months we have until the next election, this is someone who could really rise up and draw a lot of that progressive vote to him. And when that NDP number starts to tick up, that's really bad news for the Liberals.
I was just going to say
they're
that
collapsing in Quebec, the NDP. They're collapsing. They're flat on their back. They won't win a seat in the province of Quebec, and that's bad news for them. They've got well-established incumbents who aren't running again, which usually signals that they're unhappy with the direction of the party. And the Liberals can go into the next election on the center-left with a carbon tax. To say they haven't done anything about climate change will be belied by that. They're going to have something on pharmacare. The poverty rate just dropped by 3 points, according to Statistics Canada, because of the child tax benefit in part. So they've got things on the left, and they've certainly been a feminist, gender-oriented government. And they've tried to give them their due. It's been very, very hard, but they've tried on the Aboriginal file on a number of issues. So they can go to the center-left with a record of accomplishment.
John, I think Jeffrey just stole your answer.
Well, this is, and I just want to relate it structurally. This is the issue for the Conservatives really to capitalize on these opportunities. They actually need the NDP to do it, because no one's going to look to Andrew Scheer to fix climate change and to be better on feminism, and no one's going to look to the party of Stephen Harper to be better on collaborative, inclusive government, right? For the Conservative play to work, they need the NDP or the Greens or both of them to step up somehow. And the question is it possible for Jagmeet Singh to do so? Now, one thing we got to remember, everybody wrote off Justin Trudeau at this point in the cycle. Everybody's written off Jagmeet Singh. You can't write anybody off. So his low expectations may be his best friend right now. There's a point at which, though, they're so low that your caucus deserts you can't mount a campaign, and there's nothing you can do.
Well, and the numbers tell the story there, because I don't think anyone's entirely written Jagmeet Singh off, but let's look at numbers around who would make best prime minister. And this is, going back a few days now, it's probably ticked up for Andrew Scheer, not for Justin Trudeau. But at the time, Elizabeth May, according to our polling, was at about 6%, thought that she would make best PM. Jagmeet Singh was at 7%. So he has a long road to go. But that said, sometimes pathways clear up, sometimes opportunities present themselves, sometimes circumstances offer it up. But I would agree with John in terms of there is an opportunity now for the Liberals to tick hard to the left. They did it in 2015. They may have to do it even more in 2019. So let's see what the budget brings. And can you imagine, if we hadn't had the last month that we had, we'd probably all be sitting around talking about what's going to be in the budget.
Well,
no one's talking about that.
If the NDP represents a potential existential threat to a continuing Liberal government, let's ask, Ginny, I'll bring you in on this. I want to get some discussion going here on whether or not you think Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada represents a potential existential threat to the Conservative Party becoming the next government of Canada.
I don't. In many ways, Max Bernier's party is a gift, right? I mean, we Conservatives and frankly mainstream parties of all stripes have always had to figure out what to do with the candidates who want to run with them but just can't because they've got an unpleasant past or things that the party wouldn't want to associate. Well, now the Conservatives have somewhere to put them. They put them in Max Bernier's party. So, I mean, I really don't think that they're going to be a factor. Obviously, there'll be some ridings where they'll devote a ton of their resources and they may peel some votes off from the right. But those ridings are likely to go Conservative anyway. So I don't view it as hugely impactful to the polls. And I want to make a point about John's point, frankly, but put another way. On Andrew Scheer's fortunes, if he is polling at, let's say, 37% as a matter of trend today, with the NDP basically in their basement, that bodes really well for his chances if the NDP do even slightly better. And it also bodes well when you look at the seat distribution. And frankly, we don't win based on popular vote in Canada. You win elections based on how many seats and whether you can have the confidence to govern either in a minority situation or a majority situation. Scheer's got 100 seats, essentially. And while it looked like a massive sweep for the Liberals and they won a majority government, and partially it was the delta from where they went as the third party to the first party with the most seats, the number of seats the Conservatives have to convert to win government, particularly a minority government, is really not all that significant. Yeah. It's not that many. And when you look at other leading indicators like their fundraising, the numbers don't lie. They're doing very well.
Okay, let me get Jeffrey Simpson in here because, Jeffrey, I think you're just back from Western Canada, right? And I wanted to gauge your sense about whether or not you think Maxime Bernier's party can pick up what seems like increasingly populist, alienated opinion in Western Canada. What's your view?
No. I totally agree with what was just said. They'll pick up votes in Conservative districts where the Conservatives have a lot of people. And so they'll peel off, 5, 6, 7, 8, 3, percent of those people. But the Conservatives have huge majorities in most of those ridings. So if he picks 5% of the vote up, it would be consequential in very hotly contested ridings. Mm-hmm. And most of those people in hotly contested ridings who are of a Conservative persuasion won't want to waste their vote and let a dastardly Liberal or New Democrat win. So yes, he can get a certain percentage of the vote, but it won't translate, I don't think, much into seats. I really don't. I do worry about something, though, here, which is, as I just mentioned, the NDP have collapsed in the province of Quebec. That vote could go any number of ways. Liberals, even Conservatives, it could go to the, the Bloc Québécois, sorry. But I can see a situation which is unsettling of the return to some extent of the old tensions in the country between the West that feels that it's been left out and is aggrieved because of energy and because of pipelines, and the province of Quebec, which they feel gets all the attention from this government, and Quebec begins to feel besieged because it isn't understood in the rest of the country, and you get a Liberal Party whose basic support is in the province of Quebec, to some extent Ontario, and a Conservative Party that's very strong on the prairies and in rural Ontario. British Columbia is up for grabs. And that was something that the Liberal victory of Mr. Trudeau was able to overcome, because they did have support in all parts of the country, more in some than in others. And even Mr. Harper, to his credit, had a handful of seats in the province of Quebec. So we're back to a situation more like, I guess the 70s, where the Liberals had this base in Quebec and not much out in Western Canada. And that produced, on a range of policy issues, tensions, let's put it that way. Now, God help us, we're not going back into the Constitution again, but on energy and on allocation of public spending, et cetera, you can see this tension beginning to emerge. And in a nonpartisan way, it's something that I worry about. It makes governing whoever's in office more difficult.
John Duffy, I got a minute left. Take it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've noted that. I wrote about the recrudescence of 70s style politics and policy options after the 2011 election, actually, because picking up the same things that Jeff is noting, and they are coming into greater fruition. It's extremely worrisome. I think the other thing, though, that's maybe the analogy to wrestling with the Constitution as a difficult existential issue for the country is there's a nagging question here that's been brought to light in part by this week and in part by other things. I want to try to connect a couple of dots about the governability of the country. You can't get a pipeline through in Canada. Ask any business person. You can't get anything big built except for maybe transit projects in Southern Ontario. Ask anybody in the global infrastructure community. It's hard to get clear outcomes out of governments because of our federal provincial system. Canadians are allergic to politics. They no longer want their political decision makers to make tough decisions because they don't trust them, they don't believe in them. Agencies are growing more powerful, ones that are outside the purview of the elected government in areas from privacy to traditional control lobbies, as Donald Savoy would put them. What's in effect happening is we're transitioning out of a Westminster-style cabinet government, but we have, the Senate no longer answers to political authority. We got a lot of centrifugal force, not unlike what we had in the 70s happening in the country at the governance level. No one is dealing with that. And that could actually start to scrape up against the regional tensions that Jeff is describing in a way that could take us back to some old and unpleasant times in our country's history.
I want to thank all four of you for a really smart conversation tonight here on TVO. Jeffrey Simpson, Ginny Roth in the nation's capital, Shachi Kurl, John Duffy here in the provincial capital city, and we're delighted to have you all back on TVO. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Steve.
Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.